myself and I think a panel is standing between you and lunch, so I'm anticipating a lot of angry faces in the next half hour here. Yep, I'm Partrick Campbell. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a company called Price Intelligently. And today what we're going to talk about, and we're going to kind of unravel in the next 30 minutes, is a pretty big kind of finding that myself and our team discovered in sifting through just a ton of data. And it's actually changed since I submitted the talk title to Alex. We're actually now looking at over 3,000 companies at this point. And that kind of shift that we're seeing in the market really comes down to this concept that we live in a world where acquisition as we know it is dead. And the reason that acquisition is really kind of diminishing, if not really kind of dying out as the main source of growth, is because we live in a very, very different product era. And what I mean by that is if you look at the history of SaaS, in the entire world, over the course of the past 20 to 30 years, and there are some SaaS companies that were started 30 years ago, surprisingly. But very, very early on, we lived in this world where it was very single feature SaaS. So this was really, really early where perpetual licenses were being sold with on-premise software, and all of a sudden it was like, I can solve that one problem with building some sort of web app, essentially, with the really, really early companies that were basically giving away what is now something like AWS. Now, over time in this kind of product era, what we found was all of a sudden customers started asking for more. Their problem was a little bit bigger than that single feature could solve, and that laid way to multi-feature SaaS. And then over time, we kind of get into the era of SaaS that we know and love, which started seeing things like automation. Now all of a sudden it was, I want to put all my data in one place. I want my tools to talk to one another. I want them to do a lot of the work for me. And then finally, the last big era that we saw was really around consolidation, where you see companies where it's no longer, I can have one product that does something really, really well, but all of a sudden now we started to see a lot of multi-product companies start to spurt up. And the era that we're heading into, and that what we found in the data, and we're going to talk about through the data today, is really this world in software where it's all about workflow and doing it for me. And we've seen that time and time again with the different cycles throughout different verticals. Just think about sales, for example. The CRM world, how far CRMs have come, and now the new world of sales enablement, which is very, very focused on workflow and no longer showing my boss that I'm doing work, but instead just getting the work done. And what that's done fundamentally in this world of SaaS is really, it's now very, very pinpointed in terms of customer value for growth, rather than just on acquisition. So that's what we're going to unpack today, and to kind of give you some context on why I have any relevance to talk about this. As I mentioned, we started a company called Price Intelligently about 4 years ago. We have two different suites of software. The first suite of software is purely focused on pricing. So we help companies like Atlassian, Autodesk, and all the way down to earlier stage companies basically get their pricing right through market data. Then we also have a product called ProfitWell, which is free financial metrics for subscription businesses. So it plugs into your billing system, Stripe, Zora, Braintree, whatever you're using, and basically gives you your MRR cohorts, all that kind of fun stuff. And because it's free, there's a big reason why we did that, which I won't get too far into the talk today, but basically it's around customer value and what we're going to talk about. But what's fascinating about this is that over the past few years, we've now seen inside essentially more SaaS companies than anyone else out there. We have about 15% of the market using one or both of our products, and what that's given us is some really, really good insight. And as is the case with most things that we talk about, if you've read any of our blog posts, I'd rather let the data speak for itself rather than just me having any form of ethos. So let's jump into the data. And what we're going to do is we're really going to unpack this problem first. Then we're going to get into the cause of that problem that we've seen through the data. And then finally talk a little bit about solutions. And unfortunately, we can't get into all the solutions in the next 30 minutes. So it's one of those things where, unfortunately, hopefully we're going to all feel a little bad, and then all of a sudden come out towards the end with some good solutions and some good next steps. But I promise you, we're not speaking from some ivory tower. We're facing all of the same things that you guys are facing being a SaaS business ourselves. So let's kick it off with the data. So if we look at a really, really high level as we unpack this problem, what we found is that the market is becoming very, very saturated. And unfortunately, unit economics aren't what they used to be. It used to be you could start a business 15, even 10 years ago and focus on either single feature SaaS or multi-featured SaaS. And all of a sudden, you were maybe the belle of the ball, as they say. You were the only company out there. Maybe you had one or two other competitors. And basically, customers didn't have another option out there, nor let alone a better option. And so what we found, though, is that our world is becoming more competitive, and it's making switching costs so much easier. Just think again about the sales market. How many CRMs are out there? How many different sales enablement products are out there? And what's really fascinating about this is that we looked at about 5 years worth of data here, or companies that have been around for 5 years. And we actually discovered that while early on they didn't have that many competitors, over the past couple of years, their competitors have gone from single digits all of a sudden to double digits. And what's fascinating about this is this might be a product of success, right? If there's a space where all of a sudden we're all in it, all of a sudden more competitors are going to come. But even talking to companies that have only been around for about a year, what we're finding is that more and more of them are starting off with a plethora of competitors. More than half have essentially over 6, and a good majority are in that double digit. And this is because, software is easier, quote unquote, to build, right? The rise of AWS, the rise of different DevOps tools, all of a sudden we can build and ship features in a much, much more efficient manner. But what's fascinating about this is that because software has become easier and easier to ship, and we're seeing this change essentially in the cyclical revolutions of SaaS, we're also finding that the relative value of features is diminishing. And to put it another way, all software is essentially going to zero. Could be €0 or $0. Unfortunately, they're pretty equal at this point. But it's one of those things where what we're finding in the data is that customers just aren't willing to pay much or as much as they were previously. And what's interesting about this, and we'll pause here just for a second because it's a little bit of a different graph to look at. What we're seeing here is that 4 years ago, we basically benchmarked different features that existed. So for core features, we normalized different data. We basically looked at comparing things like crazy egg marketing analytics to something like Dropbox file sync and share. And then we looked at the normalized value of those features over time and essentially found that even for core features, the value is going down. And this is because there's a lot of different competitors out there. Software is easier to ship. And different things that used to be very premium add-ons like single sign-on, different integrations or support or analytics are also becoming more and more free. Give you a good anecdote. It used to be 4 years ago, you could sell a Salesforce integration for essentially $400 a month as an add-on. Now it's just kind of expected because everyone has their Salesforce integration if they're in a Salesforce type of world. But what's interesting about this too is that while this is happening, our world becoming more competitive, the relative value of features going down, costs are also going up of acquisition. So if we look at CAC, it's increasing over time. So customer acquisition costs 4 years ago were much, much cheaper than they are today in both a B2B and a B2C capacity. And this is intuitive, right? Everyone has an ebook, everyone's doing some sort of CPC ads, everyone's doing some sort of growth hacking. And what's fascinating about this is that this is all compounding on itself. You have the competitive nature of software, you have the relative value of features going down, and you have costs going up. And what's scary about this is that we're making things worse. Like we as a SaaS community are making things worse, mainly because it was so easy for us the past decade. And when I say easy, I mean relatively, right? Like building a business is never easy, but relative to today, it was much easier 4, 5, 10 years ago. But our focus is what's hurting us because we are obsessed with acquisition. And when I mean obsessed, I do truly mean stalker level obsessed. If we take a step back and really look at what we value as entrepreneurs, what we're finding is that more and more of us are both writing and consuming so much content around acquisition. And we looked at these blog posts mainly because it was a nice little kind of anthropological artifact that we could look at where if we're writing about acquisition and consuming acquisition, that's really where our focus is. And what was fascinating about this is that most articles out there about growth, about building a company, are so focused on acquisition and really aren't focused at all on retention or monetization. And what's kind of fascinating about this as well is that the companies that we are building are so focused on acquisition. What's really interesting is when you look at a really good subset of B2B companies, it's actually worse than the blog posts. You're looking at a ton of acquisition companies out there, not a lot of retention companies out there, and then the saddest club in SaaS focusing on monetization. It's us. We get together every so often. It's great. No, I'm just kidding. Now, this could be a chicken or the egg problem, right? You know, we have a lot of acquisition companies, therefore we have a lot of acquisition content. But our focus as entrepreneurs, when we talk to SaaS founders and executives, is all about getting more logos. So we talked to about 1,600 SaaS founders, and we found that if we force them to make a decision between acquisition, monetization, and retention, what did you want to focus on? Everyone was all about those more logos. You had a little small group about keeping customers around longer, but primarily people just wanted more logos. And we thought that this was a little unfair, mainly because we forced someone to make a decision. So we gave people basically 100 units of time or money. And what we found is that the trend was the same. More logos, that's all we want. And what's scary about this is that this problem that we're seeing, although it's something that is definitely fixable, it's something that has a very, very drastic implication on our growth and our success. And so this is some new data that we haven't seen before or we haven't released before. But what we looked at is we first kind of looked at how this focus was essentially hurting companies that were dying. So this is very correlative data, just to be super clear. Whenever you put graphs up and the n values are low, I feel like you have to qualify. But what's interesting about this is we looked at about 90 companies that died in the past few years. And we categorized them into two different camps. Those who are primarily focused on acquisition, and what we mean by that is their acquisition numbers were always either getting better or compounding, and then their numbers around ARPU or churn were essentially staying flat, meaning over the course of their trajectory, ARPU wasn't getting better, churn wasn't getting better, but acquisition was getting better. And then the other group was the acquisition was getting better, but so was their ARPU, so was their churn, basically these folks who had what we call balanced growth. And overwhelmingly, the implication of all of this focus is a lot of these companies are dying. And it's correlative. So what we did is we then took this data back and we looked at a much, much wider data set on what growth rates looked like amongst these two different groups over the past 4 years. And what we found is that there's a stark difference between these two groups. Those companies that are purely focused on acquisition are actually diminishing in growth. They're still growing, but they're diminishing in how much they're growing. Whereas the balanced growth folks are essentially holding their own and are growing at a much, much quicker pace. And the implication here, like to bring it all kind of back, is that this focus will kill your business. And that's what the data is suggesting. Mainly because we're all wrapped up and we do need to acquire customers. I'm not saying acquisition isn't important, but acquisition at all costs, this mentality that we've had over the past few years, is what is going to hurt us in the long run. And what's a little sad about this is that the root cause ultimately is our fault in a way because we are not focused on our buyers enough. And just as a little bit of a thought experiment, and this has not yet bit me in the butt quite yet, but how many of you in this room have some form of buyer personas in your business? Okay, good group. So keep your hands raised for a second. Of those who have buyer personas, how many of you have them in a central document that anyone or most of the team can access? Okay, we didn't lose too many people, that's awesome. Of those with their hands still raised, how many of you have your unit economics broken down by buyers? LTV, CAC, all those kind of fun things. Okay, we have like 2 people left, and I have 6 more questions. So what we're trying to get across here is that at the end of the day, if you're trying to take some data forward litmus tests on if we know our buyers, a lot of us don't have buyer personas. And when I talk about buyer personas, I don't talk about cute avatars with like fun names like Table Stakes Tony and Startup Susie. I'm talking about actual quantified buyer personas, where you've gone to the market, you've collected data, and ultimately what you've done is you've started to know who your target is and what your entire funnel is supposed to be focused on. Now, to give you a little bit of respite, most of us don't have buyer personas. And it's not to say that we don't know our buyers. Obviously, you're in a certain business for a reason, and you're hopefully growing at a certain clip. But most of us don't have a centralized repository for our buyers, nor do we have quantified buyer personas. And the reason for this, and this is where it gets a little bit sadder, is that most of us aren't talking to customers in a customer development capacity. So we looked at this list of about, I believe it's 1,600 companies here, and we asked them, how many customer development conversations are you having per month? And most are having less than 10. And there's some Fortune 2000 companies in that less than 10 bucket. That's pretty scary. Now, what's interesting is a lot of people bring up, well, I don't talk to my buyers, but I send surveys. I send customer development surveys. Nope. Most folks aren't sending that many surveys either. Less than zero essentially per month, which means less than one per quarter. And what's fascinating about this, and like the overwhelming response I get to this is, oh, well, we don't talk to our customers, we don't send surveys, but by golly, we do a lot of experiments. We do a lot of A/B testing. Nope. We're not really testing that much. And this includes marketing experiments. So a lot of us are retweeting and clicking on a lot of articles about customer development, but not a lot of us are actually doing it. And we don't realize that there's that power in that balanced growth, and there's that power in understanding your particular customers. And so what's interesting about this as well is that the balanced growth, this whole concept of making sure that you're focusing not just on acquisition, it's supported by the data as well. So we built out a model based on all the SaaS data that we're sitting on, and we basically looked at if we improve each of these three different levers by the relative same amount, meaning if we improve acquisition, your lead velocity or your conversion rate by, let's say, 1%, versus if we improve your retention by 1%, versus if we improve your ARPU by 1%, what's going to be the relative difference? And what we found is if you improve your acquisition by about 1%, in aggregate, you're going to see about a 3% boost in your bottom line. And what's interesting is that if you improve your retention by the same relative amount, you're going to see just under a 7% boost in your bottom line. And then if you improve your monetization by about 1%, you're going to see just under a 13% boost in your bottom line. And the important thing here isn't the actual numbers, it's the fact that if you improve your retention or your monetization, you're going to have a 2 to 4x impact than if you improve your acquisition. But what's scary again is, this is what we care about, and that's what works. What we care about, what works. I'll save you. I normally do that like 4 times, but I'll save you from going too deep down that rabbit hole. Okay. Now this should be really scary, and I know I'm like trying to scare you. I'm a big scary dude and all that kind of fun stuff. But what's interesting about this is that the reason that this should be so scary within your business isn't just because of the numbers, but philosophically, when you're building your business, everything that you do, from your sales and your marketing all the way to your finance and operations, is 100% focused on either driving someone to a purchasing decision or justifying the price or the product that you've put out there. Your price, your monetization, is quite literally the exchange rate on the value that you're creating. And if you don't understand that buyer, there's no way you're going to know what to put on that pricing page. I'd argue you're not going to know what to build. And I'd even argue further that the only acquisition that you're going to focus on is guess and check, which isn't the best way to grow, even if you're being acquisition focused. So now that I've hopefully scared you a little bit, how do we fix this? And I don't have enough time to go through all of the things that we found in terms of fixing. You can come chat with us throughout the day, and we're here tomorrow if you guys want to talk even further. But what's interesting about this is fixing this isn't necessarily that hard, and it's not something where I have some rocket science formula that we just cooked up in a lab somewhere, because it really is going back to the fundamentals and understanding your numbers in the first place, putting together some sort of quantified buyer persona, and then ultimately making sure that you're implementing a customer development process. And the reason that this is so important is that these fundamentals are a lot of things that we get away from. It's one of those things where we get caught up in raising money, We get caught up in making sure our customers are happy. We get caught up in doing a plethora of different things. Again, startups are relatively hard in terms of actually getting things and willing them into existence. But the thing is that the fundamentals are there for a reason, and they're there because that's what's going to help us actually grow into the long term. So in terms of knowing your numbers, it's extremely important because we see so many companies at the mid-stage, late stage, especially these folks who have grown strictly through acquisition, just not understand where the money's actually coming from and ultimately not understand where the money is leaving their business. So make sure that you have some sort of solution. We offer a solution. It's not necessarily something where I'm trying to sell here. Just make sure you have some sort of Excel spreadsheet. Make sure you're using some solution out there. Make sure you're building something. Doesn't matter what you're doing. Just make sure you understand your numbers. The original reason we actually built ProfitWell is because we were helping a company that was about to IPO with their pricing. And we actually found that their CFO was calculating MRR completely incorrectly. And their CFO had taken 2 other companies public. And it was just an amazing time where we discovered, holy cow, people don't know their numbers. And if they knew where their MRR was, it was something that fortunately they fixed, but they could have gotten even better valuations as they were going through their later stage rounds and into their IPO. And that's not the only reason to know your numbers, but if you don't know where your money's leaking out, ultimately you're not going to know how to actually fix your business. The bigger thing to do here, though, is really quantify your buyer personas. And again, what I'm talking about in terms of buyer personas is really getting everything down on paper. And an abbreviated way to do this, or to at least explain this, is the first thing that you should do, literally tomorrow, is just write down who you think your buyers are if you don't have these buyer personas, and make sure that you have everything you know about those buyers in one place, because essentially that will become the fulcrum through which you can understand who you're targeting and how you're targeting those individuals. And some more quantified ways to do this is really to go to the customer and ask them about where the value is. And you're going to do that in a really, really targeted manner. You're not just going to go up and haphazardly say, like, what do you value and what's your willingness to pay? There are a couple of models, and I'll share this afterwards with everyone in terms of how you can do this more practically. But the 2 types of data that you want to collect, one is what's called relative preference data. And this is basically having people force rank which features are more important and least important. And what's really cool about this is when you start to break down this data on any demographic information, all of a sudden you start to see where those differences in buyer personas are. And then the second type of data that's absolutely crucial is the price sensitivity analysis. And while this graph looks a little bit crazy, like, oh, that looks a little bit intimidating, it's actually really, really simple to get this type of output from customers and truly understand price elasticity. We've open sourced all of our models and all of our frameworks. So it's one of those things where you can do this absolutely on your own. You don't need to buy any software, maybe a survey tool if you don't have one already. But it's one of those things where it's absolutely crucial to have this data. And if there's anything you remember, maybe not even what data you're going to collect, it's for the love of God, talk to your customers. This is the #1 thread we see in terms of differences between companies that are failing and companies that are succeeding. It's really around understanding those customers. And the last piece here is really around implementing a customer development process. This isn't something where you can just kind of one and done everything. You have to consistently focus on these particular customers because your market's going to change, as we already saw in the data. Your customer's definitely going to change, whether it's the same customer evolving or it's different customers coming into the fold. But you have to make sure that you have some sort of process. And the typical process that we see work is basically giving someone that 20% of their role is focused on customer research or pricing in this particular case. Everyone might meet as a particular group early in the quarter, decide what they're going to test, decide what they're going to talk about. That person goes off and collects some data, comes back in week 4 or 5, basically with the data, a decision is made, and depending on the gravity of that decision, you either just put together a communication plan and ship it, or you focus on an impact analysis or customer advisory panel. But making sure that you have some sort of process, and even if it's just really easy questions for the first couple of quarters, make sure that you get the DNA of your company changed to being customer focused and not just kind of a shotgun approach of acquisition. And in terms of who should be involved, both with pricing and I would argue customer development as well, is really you want different organizational representation. So typically what we recommend is having someone from each part of the major parts of your business, product, marketing, sales, and finance. And you typically will also have, even in an earlier stage company, it might just be the couple of founders. But the big thing here is making sure that all of these people are in one room because everyone has an opinion. And with those opinions come a lot of different indecision and a lot of politicking. So you also want to make sure that there's a main decision maker who ultimately has the authority to make a decision by a specific deadline so the process doesn't keep continuing and people get gun-shy essentially in making that decision. But the big thing here is that we're in this value-centric customer world, and we need to make sure that we take advantage of the fact that we're there. One thing that's really fascinating about the European SaaS ecosystem is that because it's a little bit behind where the US ecosystem is, you essentially don't have to make the really bad mistakes a lot of these US companies have done by getting lazy essentially in the past couple of years. So it's a huge opportunity for you to make sure that you're not left behind by essentially brute forcing your growth. And one of the big things that we're focused on is really around the education and kind of releasing this data to make sure that everyone can get that same level footing to make sure that their businesses can succeed. And so we'll share a bunch of resources, check out our blog, make sure you kind of check things out in terms of this data in the context of your business. And then even today, what we're gonna do is we're gonna kind of help spur a little bit of this data further and make sure that we can kind of really make the pay it forward movement that's already in the nice European SaaS ecosystem continue. But we're gonna host some workshops here, both during lunch as well as later in the day at the afternoon break. Basically, one focus on actually going deeper on how you can collect that relative preference data as well as the price sensitivity data. And then later in the day, exposing just the world's largest SaaS data set, essentially, on things like churn, annual subscriptions, et cetera. The big thing here, though, is that it's important to take action. So if you're ever at a point where you're not taking action or you have a question and you can't find the information on our blog, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help push you in the right direction and make sure that you're moving your company forward and you're growing in the right direction. Thanks.